CatSynth TV.
Hey everybody, JB here for CatSynth TV. Today I am talking to one of my favorite guitarists and composers, someone whose career I've been following going on 30, 40 years, whatever it is now at this point, Pat Irwin. Pat, thanks for taking the time to speak with us today.
Thanks for having me.
Yeah, great to have you here. Just as a brief introduction for those who may not know Pat's work, Pat did some legendary early albums with Lydia Lunch, Queen of Siam, Eight-Eyed Spy, was a founding member of the Raybeats, fantastic instrumental kind of surf influenced band. We'll get into that a little bit more later on. Touring member and actually recorded a bit with the B-52s and has had a 30-year at least career in scoring films and TV shows and documentaries, and has some new musical projects which we will talk about as well. Pat, let's kind of let's go a little bit back. One of the things that I found kind of surprising on my end is you did not study composition in college. Is that right? You were a journalism major?
No, I was it was called American Studies. Which was a kind of a combination of history and literature. I was not a journalism major either.
Oh, really? Okay, my mistake.
That's cool.
You on that. Yeah, I found that really amazing because especially, with the work that you did later on, have been doing later on, more recently in soundtracks, it seems like there's a wealth of knowledge there about harmony and using things in a very creative way, influenced by, the film composers of the past. Did you listen to a lot of that music kind of coming up when you were forming your own musical identity? How did that come about?
Oh man, yeah, I listened to everything and anything. And I've always loved soundtracks. I mean, I think about, guys my age and women my age, we talk about seeing the Beatles on Ed Sullivan, which was very real. I saw that, and that looked like a really good job to me. I want to do that. But at the same time, I was aware of the soundtrack to Goldfinger and Thunderball.
Right. John Barry. Sure. Yeah. Fantastic stuff.
Just completely turned me upside down. And it still does, actually. I listened to Thunderball this morning. It just seemed like the same sort of deal. I want to do that.
Right. And so you did spend some time in Paris where you came into contact with Brian Geisen, William Burroughs, John Cage at various points. Did that sort of, Cage is famous for chance operations, Brian Geisen and Burroughs for the cut-ups and using just these unexpected combinations of things. Did any of that influence your compositional voice, maybe for the soundtrack stuff later on?
Hell yeah.
Right.
It changed my life. All three of those guys.
Sure.
I mean, I took composition workshops with John Cage, which was just a life changer.
Sure.
Not only I was aware of him almost as a countercultural figure, more so than a composer, and then later became much more aware of his work. But his conviction alone still influences me to this day. Sure. I mean, I've never, met anybody so kind and generous and with so much conviction about music and composition. It was Geisen that encouraged me to seek him out. I mean, I was living in Paris and Brian said to me, you really only have two choices. You either need to study with Nadia Boulanger,
sure,
or Brian Geisen. And I went, with John Cage. And I met with Nadia Boulanger a couple times.
Really?
Yeah.
Ah.
Yeah, that was pretty heavy.
Yeah.
And but clearly not the place for me. Although she was really kind to me and invited me back, and it was really nice. But it was John Cage that turned me upside down. And this is what I wanted to do. I mean, I was a rock and roll fan, but I'm also a big classical music fan.
Sure.
And just to meet that pair, Nadia Boulanger and John Cage, was just life changing. Right. So, you know, and soundtracks, you know, you being in a band, you kind of learn on the job.
Right.
At least I did anyway. And the same goes for writing soundtracks.
Sure.
Nobody really told me what to do or how to do it. I just kind of learned on the job, and you learn pretty quickly.
Sure. And one of the reasons you were in Paris, as I understand it, was to interview a number of different American expatriate jazz musicians. Steve Lacy, Mal Waldron, wasn't Kenny Clark possibly there as well, or am I?
No, not Kenny Clark, but Dexter Gordon.
Dexter Gordon, okay.
Alan Silva, Bobby Few.
Right.
You know, there was quite an expatriate jazz community there of
right.
some pretty well-known musicians and some not so well-known.
Right.
And I had received a grant from the Thomas J. Watson Foundation to investigate. My project was to investigate American expatriate jazz musicians, which I did, but I didn't really. Well, I did, I guess. I interviewed a tremendous trumpet player named Bill Coleman, and I wrote an article for the Village Voice, and but I didn't really follow through on any sort of writing project. It was too real.
Sure.
I mean,
sure.
I didn't know. I was in over my head. Maybe that's a better way to put it.
Right. And so has jazz been a big influence on you personally and your writing? Because, you know, I mean, to some, you know, a lot of what I've heard, at least, you know, from Eight Night Spy and the Raybeats and later on, you know, it's more in a rock and roll kind of starting point and going from there. But has jazz kind of informed your writing personally?
Oh, absolutely. Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, but what's for me personally about that is I'm not a jazz musician, and never in a million years would I ever dream of that. You know, that's another world.
Sure.
But as a fan, yeah. Oh man, I mean, in college and growing up, I saw the art ensemble and. Wow. You know, Ornette Coleman, Mingus, Bill Evans, Roland Kirk, you know, just the joy of it.
Sure.
Pretty much sticks with me to this day.
Right. So on your return to the U.S., you came back to New York in the late 1970s, and then, you know, while you were away, let's say in Paris, you were there for a few years. Did you hear what was going on, kind of bubbling up as far as, you know, the beginnings of the punk rock thing and what would be, you know, kind of retroactively labeled the no wave thing? Were you aware of that scene before you came back?
Punk rock, yes. You know, that was bubbling up before I left even, you know, sure. But I wasn't, you know, I didn't really, well, I had seen the New York Dolls, but I didn't really see anybody. And I saw all those bands that are associated with CBGBs. I saw them in Europe.
Oh, really?
Yeah. Talking Heads in Paris. I also went to school in London for like a junior year away or something. It must have been 75 and 76. And I saw The Clash. I saw Wire. I mean, I was a Buzzcocks.
Sure.
I was aware of that music, and it really turned me on.
Sure.
Killed me. You know, the power. And I mean, it just took rock and roll into a new place, which it really needed badly.
Sure.
And I was lucky enough to be there in London, and then when I moved to Paris, I came back to the United States for a minute, and then I was in New York for a minute. In New York, actually, I saw Suicide at that time,
Oh,
but
fun.
yeah, they were the first band I saw at CBGB's.
Uh-huh.
Now that I think about it, and a couple other bands. I saw B-52s. I saw the B-52s, but I in Paris, I saw Patti Smith. I saw Talking Heads, Blondie, and I saw those bands there. And you could get the Village Voice, and you could get maybe even, I think that's the only magazine I could get when I was there. But I was aware of CBGB's and Max's Kansas City, and I knew that when I moved back to New York, that that's all I wanted to do.
Oh, really?
Yeah, all I wanted to do was play either CBGB's or Max's Kansas City. I didn't know how or where or what, but that's what I wanted to do. I really wasn't aware of No Wave, but I certainly learned about it quickly when I moved back to New York.
Sure, sure. And so how did that come about? Well, I guess this is a two-part question. So you moved back, and then, you created two of, at least for many years, they were my favorite albums. That cassette on Roar, that orange cassette of the 8 Spy, I'm talking about, and Queen of Siam, another thing that just took the top of my head right off. So how did you meet with Lydia Lunch? How did all of that happen? And what is the sequence? Which came first? That's what I'm never clear on. 8 Spy or Queen of Siam?
Well, first of all, I had a loft on 27th Street.
Uh-huh.
And I was like in the Flower District, and I was on the tail end of that time where you could live really cheaply.
Yeah.
You could have dinner at the happy hour, down at the bar, and they'd be fine. Eating tidbits of this and that at the Shannon Pot or whatever the Irish bar was. I had a roommate who knew George Scott.
Okay.
And George and Lydia were friends. And so, first of all, I want to make it really clear, to contradict something that Lydia said in the interview you did, 8 Spy was George and Lydia's idea.
Okay.
That they wanted to form a band, right, and they wanted to form a band together. Mm-hmm. And I had met George up at my place, and we started to play at the same time. Lydia, I mean, literally at the same time, Lydia had a record deal to make Queen of Siam.
Okay.
So 8 Spy was playing,
right,
or rehearsing, maybe is a better way to put it. And we were making Queen of Siam at the same time. Sure. And then George went off to play with John Cale.
Right.
And we finished Queen of Siam. And that record came out. And then when it came time to promote it and tour it, 8 Spy was happening. Okay. So Lydia had 8 Spy. She didn't want to promote Queen of Siam particularly.
Really?
And so when we were going to play, like when Lydia had a gig to play like a Z Records thing, all she had was 8 Spy. But, so it gets very confused and intertwined.
Sure.
Yeah. But it really, but it's George that had 8 Spy. And Lydia knew Sklavunas. Of course, George knew Jim as well. And then Michael, George knew Michael from a record store that George worked at called Musical Maze.
Okay.
Up on just down a block on 23rd Street from 23rd. And we just, made up songs really fast.
Okay, we're going to geek out for a minute for all the tech heads out there. I got to ask you, George Scott had that fantastic bass tone. I mean, is that like a Rickenbacker with the Ricko sound, like active pickup in there? What, how did he get that big chunky, bass sound?
Yeah, it's like playing. He sounded like a motorcycle.
Yeah.
He used thin picks
Uh-huh.
and played really hard.
Right.
And he used short scale basses.
Okay.
And he used a PV head
Right.
with a big Sun cabinet. But
Nice.
he would get that sound no matter what he played on. Except, yeah, 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 yeah. In the studio when we were recording, not he didn't quite get his sound. We didn't have it. It went so fast.
Mhm.
But that's it. I mean, he played really hard, and he loved like surf music, the Ventures, and he would do that Don Wilson, and that was his idea
Mhm.
of playing on a bass.
Right.
Totally unconventional.
Right. Yeah, fantastic sound. Again, I'm going to go back to that cassette on Roar, and one of the compositions that still takes the top of my head off, not only for the bass sound, but just for the whole structure, is Motor Oil Shanty, which is just an amazing piece of work. And it's, I listened to it, for years and years as a young fellow, and it wasn't until later that I, learned a little bit more about music theory and so forth. I mean, there's a couple bars of odd meter in there, maybe at that and just everything that's going on. I mean, it's just, for a band that, you think of surf music or blues based music as being, perhaps many people think of it as simpler forms of music or whatever. But, really, there's a lot going on. And especially the way that you folks synthesized all of that with the fantastic, Lydia's just kind of howling over the top of it, and this very, this sprawling structured composition. It's just so amazing. And it's just, I got to tell you, like, again, I'm geeking out a little bit here, but just that's one of those compositions that have made a huge impact on me personally. And
Oh
so,
man, thank you. Yeah,
yeah.
that it's cool you mentioned that. I'm it's putting me back there. George had that lick,
Mhm.
and I could just remember him playing with his pick real fast, and
Right.
it's like, what is this? And Lydia had lyrics ready to go, and that was a real band. That was a real band effort.
Okay.
That came together as a band,
Right.
no question.
So concurrently, let's say it this way, with Eight-Eyed Spy going on, because I know George Scott was an early member as well of the Raybeats, another fantastic surf-influenced band. Although I would say, there's a lot of Dwayne Eddy and different things in that band. So perhaps at that time, we're talking about the late 1970s, maybe around 1980, that music, instrumental rock music, was perhaps not the most popular thing in the world. But I think that, through the efforts of that band and some others, it kind of started like a mini renaissance of that stuff coming on. What was the decision to make that happen? Like, how did you just say, look, I want to do some instrumental music as well? How did that come about?
Well, it came about because George, Don, and Jody were in the Contortions together, and they just wanted to keep playing.
Sure, sure.
And Eight Eyed Spy was doing its thing, but George and Don and Jody got together to play, and George was a massive instrumental rock and roll fan.
Oh yeah.
Massive. He turned me on to stuff that I never would have known, and so is Don.
Mhm.
And and Jody and I as well, but really those guys were like freaks, and came at it kind of from different places. Don might be more like the Booker T and the MGs and the Meters, and George would be more like Link Ray and Dwayne Eddy and the Astronauts and the Pyramid, surf stuff, which
Right.
Don also really knew. I mean, surf music was really big in the Midwest where we were all from.
Okay.
So we all knew that music really well. We just all knew it. And I still have, my records, and we all, knew it. So we all wanted to be in it. It seemed like a good idea.
Sure.
It wasn't really like calculated. Like we're going to have, it was just like, oh, well, this is a good idea. Let's do it. We're going to do it. And we got together. I remember the first song we did, it was on the first record called Big Black Sneakers. And that was like a lick that Jody, Don, and George had like for one rehearsal before I got together. And then we got together and we just threw together. Don would have beats, and they were somewhat like tight turn, kind of started out from a beat. And maybe George and Don had the groove, if you will. And then I just added a saxophone up on top of it, and there it went. And what was cool about it that time was there were places to play. Mm-hmm. So, you could walk down the street or up the block to like Tier 3 or the Mud Club and play. Right. And that's what we would do. We could play.
Right.
And it wasn't like, some big mystery. You played, which was fun.
Right. Fantastic. So, as we were kind of touching on maybe there at point, George Scott was involved with, the early Raybeats. Unfortunately, he passed, and Eight Eyed Spy never got a proper, quote unquote, studio recording with the band as it was at that time, right? Didn't you play the bass on the studio recordings, right? And most of that stuff has been reissued on, the original album had a different cover, but wasn't it reissued maybe about 15, 20 years ago on, it was called Luncheonette or something like that, a CD that collected all of that stuff for the most part, which is fantastic stuff. And I highly recommend anyone out there who has not heard this stuff, you have got to hear this stuff. It is just some of the most, for me at least, some of the most mind-blowing stuff I have ever heard. It's just got energy, and it's got sophistication, and it's punk, and it's everything you want to hear. So continuing on with the Raybeats went on and recorded a number of fantastic albums, and then kind of went their own ways. But what was it, 2012, 2013, this CD appeared for me out of nowhere, the Philip Glass Sessions. Can you give us a little bit of context? How did this happen? And like, it's either Philip Glass or Michael Reisman, one of his longtime associates, keyboard players, plays on that album with you as well, doing the Philip Glass kind of thing on that. How did that happen? That's just
Philip plays on it too. It happened through a couple different things. Philip had a studio, the floor below mine, when I moved to Tribeca.
Okay.
So he had a studio, which was his studio called Looking Glass, and he was starting to make his records. But we knew him well before that because Don was friends with Kurt Munkasey, who was Philip's sound engineer. And on all those early Philip Glass ensemble recordings, Kurt is doing the sound. And Philip, so we were friendly. Mm-hmm. And Philip was around, and New York was like that. There was so much energy going on, mostly in the rock and roll clubs, but hip hop, jazz, and the lofts in particular. But it wasn't really there in classical music. Sure. And Philip wanted that energy. He saw that audience, that energy, and he wanted in on it. And he got it. He wanted to play, he wanted to produce bands, and he wanted to produce us. Right. And that's really it. And he played Danceteria and Peppermint Lounge and The Bottom Line, and he wanted to get bigger, and he did.
Sure.
And rightfully so. Right. I mean, Philip is another one I would speak of in the same breath as John Cage as one of the most generous and giving musicians I've ever met. kind, caring, and just giving,
Right. Well,
powerful, serious. I mean, man, I mean, just how can you, I mean, there aren't many on his level, on Philip Glass.
Well, it's fascinating stuff, and it's the album itself, the Philip Glass Sessions. There'll be a picture of the cover right here. Just really another one of these fascinating things, very much worth searching out, especially for the kind of very interesting kind of confluence of different streams of music coming together and making something fantastic and new. Now, in the late 80s, you mentioned the B-52s. In passing earlier, you did become a member of the touring band for the B-52s, and you appear on at least one studio album on a couple tracks, if I'm not mistaken, right? You appear on, let me look it up here, Good Stuff, right? The one that was done without Cindy Wilson.
Yeah.
How did the association with the B-52s come about? How did that happen?
Well, the Raybeats did shows with the B-52s.
Okay.
Very early.
Right.
I mean, and I remember a mutual friend brought Kate to see us at the Mud Club,
Mhm.
and then the Bees would be playing in similar places as us, and I was friendly with Fred. The Raybeats played Athens, Georgia. I think I produced a band called Love Tractor, and
Right.
they were down there in Athens, and by that time, actually, they had all moved up to New York, but basically we were intersecting all the time. And but some of the most fun Raybeats shows were ones where we opened for the B-52s, and then they were making a record which became Cosmic Thing, and then finished it, or were mixing it or something. And Kate said, we're thinking that we want to play. Do you want to play? And I was like, yeah,
Right.
yeah. And we met with, and Sarah Lee and Zach Alford. We met down in Lower Manhattan in a little rehearsal space, and we just played. And we weren't really going to play for very long. It was just going to be a couple of weeks, but we rehearsed pretty hard.
Right.
And so it was just sort of in the air. Right. And I love B-52s,
Sure. Let me just interject there for a little bit of context. The touring band that you're mentioning there, Sarah Lee, of course, played with Gang of Four and Robert Fripp in the League of Gentlemen. Zachary Alford went on to play with David Bowie, amongst others. So just an incredibly kick and rhythm section for the band at that time, including yourself. Just fantastic stuff. You were taking over on guitar duties for the late, great, and greatly underappreciated Ricky Wilson, who had passed on by that point. Again, some gear questions we're going to geek out on right here. Ricky Wilson, legendary for using a very different a lot of different tunings that he used on his guitar. Didn't he at one point have like a 5-string guitar with 2 bass strings as the 2 lowest? Now, when you were adapting these things for your style, because don't you play like Strats mostly? He used those Most Right guitars tuned to his special way. What was that like, kind of trying to, suss out, no pun intended for suss, right, for your later band, but to figure out what was going on, and how to adapt it to your style and make it work with this very different kind of rhythm section?
Yeah. Well, I was just thinking on it because I have one of Ricky's guitars, but it's not here right now. With the 3 lower strings, D, A, D, and then the top 2 are B in unison, and there's no string where the G would be. It's so far out.
Yeah.
And you play that, and you immediately, it's like Lava and Dance This Mess Around. He was thrilling. I mean, my God, what a force, and utterly unique. And just to be clear, I didn't play all the guitar. I played some guitar. Keith moved from drums to guitar.
Right. Yes.
And he's a kick-ass guitar player. And whenever I would play Ricky's parts, I would just get chills.
Uh-huh.
But I would play them in standard tuning, I think. I'm not quite clear on exactly. I can't quite remember what I did on what right now, but I wouldn't use his tunings until later.
Oh, really?
Yeah, I didn't really bother. I mean, maybe I would tune down, but it just didn't. We weren't that kind of a band. I mean, we weren't really trying to duplicate the sound of that 1979 B-52s.
Right.
We really had a pretty different sound.
Yeah.
And Sarah and Zach and I mean, we got pretty tough. And you look at some of those B-52s videos, and man, that band is tough.
Yeah.
We put it over, and there's nothing like playing a stadium full of people in front of a stadium full of people, like shouting back the lyrics to Private Idaho. This is some killing rock band as far as I'm concerned.
Right.
This is not Baby I Love You.
Right.
It was fun. It was really fun.
Sure.
And the Bees were one of my favorite bands. I mean, I loved, like you said, the punk rock, bands and no wave. But then when the Bees hit, it was like completely fresh.
Sure.
So when I got the opportunity to play with them, I didn't hesitate.
Right. So about this time as well, we're talking about late 80s, early 90s, you start to, as well as working with the B-52s for many years, you started to moving into soundtrack work. How did that happen? How did that move happen? Was there just, you got asked for one to do the soundtrack to one film and it just led to more work, or was it something that you sought out? How did that change come about?
It just sort of evolved, like you said. I mean, oddly, I think it happened a little bit before, but I don't know the exact dates. You'll probably be able to get on it faster than I do. But I lived in a neighborhood, and by that time I moved to Queens, and I was living in Long Island City, which is incidentally, the first where Tina and Chris and Jerry Harrison from the Talking Heads lived, and Ernie Brooks still lives there from the Modern Lovers. Don Cherry lived there. And some of the Talking Heads records were made in their place just a couple blocks from where I live. And it was just, cheap real estate again, which is such the X factor and all of this,
Right.
And I lived around the corner from a production studio, TV studio, and they were filming Tales from the Dark Side there.
Oh, wow. Okay.
And I was just walking down the block, and this guy goes, "Are you Pat Irwin?" And I was, yeah, I mean, I get recognized like maybe once every 3 or 4 years.
Okay.
It doesn't happen very often.
Sure.
And I said, yeah, and he was a big Raybeats fan.
Oh, great.
He said, "Do you want to write music for this show, Tales from the Dark Side?" And I said, hell yeah. And the first one I did was I had just started to produce Love Tractor. So I did it in the overnight, in the studio down in Atlanta.
Oh, okay. You had like time, like a week booked, and you did it after the session, so forth.
Yeah, that kind of thing.
Yeah.
I mean, I didn't know what I was doing. I'm not so sure I do now either. But and so that led to another one and another one. I did more.
Right.
And then I also had this sort of other hat that I put on, and I was writing music for choreographers and downtown theater, performance theater, performance art. And I did a concert at a space called Dance Theater Workshop. And a critic, Robert Palmer,
right,
was a big Raybeats fan and an Eight-Eyed Spy fan, and he wrote an article on my concert in the Times, not huge or anything, but just a review. And a producer, again in Atlanta from Turner Broadcasting, read the review and hired me to do a documentary. compose a score for a documentary based on that review.
Mhm.
And I ended up doing, I think, three movies for Turner Broadcasting,
Right.
for documentary films. And then that led to doing a documentary for Jacques Cousteau, I think, which was fun. And then whatever. I
Right.
can't remember. Yeah.
Well, I got to tell you this. I mean, again, one of these things that happened to me, I'm a huge fan of animation as well of creative, adventurous music and so forth. And sometime in the 90s, somebody said, you should really check out this show. This is really interesting. They loaned me a video cassette of Rocko's Modern Life. And I was watching it and, I really enjoyed the show. But at the same time, I was almost like, what is this music? This is like some really fantastic music going on for the score. And then I saw your name in the end credits, and it was like, is that the same guy? Is that the same guy from Eight-Eyed Spy and all those great records? And of course it was. How did that gig come about, man? That just and I gotta say, once again, that is some amazing music, man. It's just like, again, it's just like I found myself, I watched the cartoon and then I rewound it and I was just listening to the score. I mean, it's so wonderful,
Oh man, thank you. Well, have you heard there's a release, so you can hear that music. It's on Spotify.
Oh man, okay, I'm gonna find it. I'm gonna listen to it today. Oh
Yeah, dude, it'll kill you. I'm sorry, but I'm really proud of that stuff. And what's really hip is that on September 19th, Nickelodeon and Republic Records is going to release an expanded version of it, and they're going to release the theme with Kate and Fred from the Bees,
right.
and about another half hour, 45 minutes worth of music from Rocko.
Oh.
Man, that was one of the best bands of all time. It was so much fun. I got to tell you, who was in this band? I mean, Kevin Norton on drums. He was the drummer at that time with Anthony Braxton.
Oh wow.
Hofstra played bass. Dave Hofstra,
right? Sure.
Who was playing with the Raybeats at that time, and then other, anybody, Elliot, just Elliot Sharp, John Zorn, downtown kind of go-to fantastic musician.
Right.
Art Barron plays the trombone, and Art is the last living guy to be the trombone player to be with the Duke Ellington Orchestra. So right. Art played with Duke Ellington. I'm just going to repeat that.
Yeah, just heavy band. Yeah, keep going, man. It's just
Duke
amazing.
Ellington.
Right.
I mean, I got to work with a guy who played with Duke Ellington, and Rob DeBellis plays most of the woodwinds. He was with Don Byron and Muhal, Richard A. So anyway, this killing group, these guys could read anything.
Yeah.
And that was like how I studied composition.
Mm-hmm.
That was like, they helped me. They helped me learn. And it came about because the guy, again, the Raybeats, it was an executive at Nickelodeon, was a Raybeats fan, and they were just starting to do animation. They had what was called Ren and Stimpy was in the works,
right.
And they were starting to develop their own original cartoons. And I think Rocko might have been the first at their studio. In fact, I know it was. Mm-hmm. And we did it. We just flew. And man, every week it was like being inside of an engine.
Mm-hmm.
I those deadlines were brutal.
Right, sure.
And I think I was on the road also with the Bees.
Oh, wow.
So, we would fly in to do the sessions or whatever. It was fun. It was cool. I loved it. I mean, you could just dare to be stupid.
Right.
And it's a really good cartoon.
Oh, yeah, it's fantastic. So walk us a little bit through, how a scoring session might go with, for example, an episode of Rocko's Modern Life. Would the director come in and say, look, I want a little bit of, kind of Mickey Mousing here, walking up the stairs, and say, in this style or so forth? Would they give you a bunch of spots where they want music, or how would that work?
Yeah, that's kind of funny. Because he would send me his notes by fax.
Mhm.
And I would get storyboards in the very beginning. I had storyboards, so I had the picture and timing.
Okay.
I had these drawings,
Yep.
and the timings. And he would say that. He would say things like, "Well, there you got to climb the ladder of anxiety." I remember. I mean, some of it was pretty obvious if the character's going up the stairs and down the stairs.
Right.
And we talked. It was mostly a vocabulary that we established very early on. He loved the B-52s.
Mm-hmm.
And we both loved Warner Brothers cartoons.
Yep.
Mickey and Carl Stalling famously
Sure.
was the music director on those, on adapting the themes from Raymond Scott.
Scott and others, sure, yeah.
And so those were just that was my jumping off point. And I sort of took it to, it was like all my loves of rock and roll is like Link Ray and Sandy Nelson, Iggy Pop, whatever, just let it go and go wild. And we had a really, really great music editor.
Yep.
But we would record live to 2-track.
Okay.
We would set up at like 8 a.m. Early. Musicians would come in. Sometimes it was live, and we would mix it in the same day.
Oh, wow.
My wife would drive down in front of the studio with a car. I'd run down with the tape, the DAT tape, like a little cassette. We'd go down to FedEx. The FedEx guy was at the dock. He knew I was in the B-52s, and he was a fan, and but he also he knew the cartoon.
Oh, wow.
So they would, they wouldn't
eat you as much as possible, right?
But they would keep the trucks for us. It would make the last truck go out to Kennedy and then be in LA in the morning.
Right.
I mean, it was just boom, 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 boom.
Right.
And it went on to the cartoon the way I mixed it. It was just 2 tracks live. So and then there was some MIDI, but it was mostly live. And we had guests come in. Tony Trischka played banjo. Laura Seaton played violin. I can't remember who else, but if we needed a sound, if we needed an accordion, Rachel Garnier would come in and play accordion or something. For particular, like a romantic scene, like as if it was in a French restaurant or something.
Right. Sure.
Really fun. It's really fun. Stuff you could never do in a rock and roll band.
Right.
You could really, really dare to be stupid. And it was fun.
Well, this is one of the things, of course, that I loved so much and still love so much about the soundtrack is it goes all over the place, and yet it's always got that twangy guitar out there, and it's like, God, that's just an amazing collection of sounds and influences, making, again, something very unique and personal. So wonderful stuff. Now, it seems like possibly your work in doing the soundtrack stuff, the kind of cinematic way of thinking of things, has influenced one of your more recent bands, Sus, which has been described as sort of an ambient country band. Can you talk a little bit about that band and how that came about, and what you're trying to get across with the sound there?
I like ambient. Yeah, I mean, again, this is a group of friends. It started off as a group of friends. We would meet for lunch at this kind of legendary deli, again in just south of 23rd Street, and we were all fans of music fans. Music for airports in particular, Ry Cooder, and I would make these CDs I call them lost and found CDs, instruments that I would collect on the road, mostly with the bees, that I would find like in thrift stores or pawn shops or yard sales or something, whether it's an auto harp or a ukulele, a chord organ, I would find this stuff and I would make these CDs quickly,
right,
and then hand them out to everybody for Christmas presents. And I did that for 5 years, I think. And eventually, after a couple 5 years or so, Bob from the band, our little lunch group, said, "Let's form a band." And I was a little reluctant. But because being in a band is weird, but he pushed it, and I loved his idea, which was like, what would it be like if Eno met Ennio, and Ennio Morricone produced Eno produced Ennio Morricone,
right,
and I thought, well, I can get behind that.
right.
And I had a studio, so I could, and all these instruments, so I could kind of push it, or whatever you want to call it. We just started to make stuff. We made records, and we made a record. And well, maybe even when we started, we didn't know it was going to be a record. It was just the first Sus record called
Right.
Ghost Box. And one way or the other, I heard about this label called Northern Spy, and they agreed to put it out. And then we kept going.
Stuff is completely amazing. I really dig it. It's a new take on things. I mean, you mentioned Eno. It kind of reminds me a little bit of the Apollo soundtrack, or Apollo, I think that was the soundtrack, wasn't it? The Apollo album that he did.
Yeah, the one with Daniel Lanois
With
playing.
Lanois, right, and some of Lanois' things and so forth. But really, again, you hear strands of that, but it's its own very original thing, and I really dig it. And one more thing that you've been doing as of late, which connects way back to the beginning of this interview, you've got the Pat Irwin Trio, or is it called the Pi Trio? I'm not clear on that.
Yeah, Pi Power Trio.
Pi Power Trio, fantastic stuff. And way back when we talked about Queen of Siam, and there is that wonderful tune on there, Atomic Bongos, which as I understand it, you've brought back into the repertoire. I mean, you've got this huge catalog of music, and it's wonderful that you are able to draw on this stuff, continuously throughout all these years. I mean, can you talk a little bit about the Pi Power Trio?
Yeah, I can. It's two friends of mine that I met through a mutual friend in my neighborhood in Queens, J. Walter Hawks, who he and I made an album together, trombone player. And it's with Sasha Dobson, plays drums and sings. And Sasha has a band with Nora Jones called Puss in Boots.
Okay.
And Daria Grace plays bass and sings, and she has a band with Walter called the Pre-War Ponies, both really good bands. And I can remember the first song we ever played was Jack the Ripper.
Okay.
And neither of them had really played that kind of stuff before. And it was like, well, let's do this again. And it just gives me a chance to put on my rock and roll hat.
Right.
And we did a tour. We did a tour with Nick Lowe, which was fun. Cool. And then we stopped for a while. And now we're just starting it up again. And it just lets me put on my rock and roll hat.
Sure.
And we're definitely going to do Atomic Bongos. And they pushed for it. I don't remember which one of them. I think they both know the record.
Right.
But, and it made me go back and write down the lyrics. And we just did our thing on it. I was like, well, okay, let's do this.
Yeah.
It's fun.
Well, it's all amazing music. And once again, Pat Irwin, I'm so thrilled to have had this opportunity to talk with you today across this wide range of music that you've done over all the years. And it's great to see you still out there doing it, and may it continue for 100 more. You know what I'm talking about? Hey.
I do, man. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Okay,
fun, man.
ladies and gentlemen, Pat Irwin. All
Thank
right.
you. Thank you.
To find out more about the music of Pat Irwin, please visit his website and check out the description below this video. Thanks for watching, and please subscribe to CatSynth TV.
Hi, this is Pat Irwin, and you're watching CatSynth TV.